How were late medieval armies recruited? Hi folks, Matt Easton here. Now recently we've looked at the age ranges of medieval knights in late medieval England, and we've also talked about the ratio of archers versus knights or men-at-arms and how archers were so important in the late medieval army. And this raised a question under both those videos about how were late medieval soldiers recruited. Now I'm going to specifically look at the English experience here, late medieval, primarily 15th century. This stretches also into the 14th century. So late medieval and English, but by expansion this does relate strongly to how soldiers were recruited across a wide swathe of Europe as well. And this is actually an incredibly complicated and detailed topic, so this is going to be very much a brief introduction. Now this topic has been dealt with in depth by lots of other people over the years, and lots of books of course since historians started writing about medieval history. But recently I have been reading this fantastic book, which I'll link down below, The Wars of the Roses, The Medieval Art of Graham Turner, and this is a signed copy from Graham Turner, and he has been a reenactor and a jouster, but he's most famous for being an artist who makes all this amazing art, and he covers a wide range of historical periods. But this particular book, which came out not that long ago, I think about maybe a year ago, maybe less than that now, is just The Wars of the Roses. And in it he gives a very succinct and well, actually detailed, but also quite good at being concise explanation of how armies in the Wars of the Roses were recruited. But you can relate this to the rest of medieval Europe, and it gives a really good summary. So if you want more detail, I highly recommend this book, but as I say, there are other books which deal with this topic in depth. So the summary: how were late medieval English armies recruited? So first up we have the system of livery and maintenance, and this is an expansion and extraction of feudal relationships. So fundamentally you've got the king, and then you've got the nobility below that, and you've also got the three estates. In other words, there's the monarchy, there's those who fight, there's the church, and there is those who work, essentially the farmers primarily. So in this system, the knights, if we call them that, the nobility, their feudal obligation is to provide military service in return for land from the king. Okay, so within that they have a similar relationship with those below them, who are they're directly paid and maintained, hence livery and maintenance, retainers essentially. So we'll call them retainers for the purposes of this video. So when a knight is called to give military service for their lord or their king, they will provide a certain number of soldiers, and that is by agreement, and sometimes that number might vary based on how many people they can actually recruit from their land and how much land they've got and things like that. Now within that livery and maintenance system there are two main types of soldiers. There are those who are primarily workers, who they raise from the land, mixture of, for example, archers and men-at-arms and spearmen and billmen, people like this, sometimes gunners and crossbowmen. And they are people who have other jobs. They are not full-time soldiers, but they are raised for a specific campaign. And then secondly, and very important, there are the feedmen, as they're sometimes called, in other words paid with a fee, permanent retainers and household troops. So in other words, a lord, a knight, will have both permanent, like essentially permanent soldiers, a regular miniature standing household soldiers. So your job might be to be a permanent archer, that is your pure job, and to follow your lord around. But in addition, when they're called up for war, they also get a whole load of other troops from their land, who are billmen and archers, usually in the Wars of the Roses. And they're raised for a specific campaign for a specific amount of time. So two different systems there. But fundamentally, when they're called up, they wear the livery of their lord. In other words, they wear something like a badge or a particular sort of tabard or surcoat with the colours and the emblems of their lord. So essentially heraldry. And they wear that badge, and in return they are maintained by that lord. So that is the system of livery and maintenance. Now this of course led to a great big problem in the Wars of the Roses, because very powerful lords like the Duke of York or the Earl of Warwick had extremely large personal armies, essentially. And so fundamentally, when you got two lords who were at odds with each other, with different perhaps arguments over land borders, or other kind of trade disputes and things like this, taxes, then fundamentally, or even just personal disputes, then fundamentally they would essentially get into what was the military massed melee version of a duel, and they would have a private war. And this was essentially what happened in parts of the Wars of the Roses, where one lord had a standing army, another lord had a standing army, and they had a personal war between each other. So the system of livery and maintenance led sometimes to individual nobles becoming too powerful for the king to handle, and also led to escalating war and conflict. Now, the next type of raising troops is known as the indenture system, and this was closely related to livery and maintenance, but it usually came down from the king at the top via his captains. So in other words, when the king decided, for example, Henry V decided to go on campaign in France, fought at Harfleur, Agincourt, and all of the military campaigns that went after that as well. Essentially, he created the system, just as Edward III had and other kings before that, of indentures, which were essentially contracts. So in other words, he assigned a bunch of captains for the campaign, and each of those captains basically sent out word that they were looking for soldiers to sign contracts, and the contract was for a specific amount of pay, for a specific type of military service, so for example to serve as a mounted knight, or serve as a spearman on foot, or serve as an archer, a mounted archer or a foot archer, etc. And so you would sign a contract for the certain type of service, for a certain amount of pay, for a certain amount of time. So it literally was a contract which entirely defined what your military service was, and you owed that to a captain, and the captain owed their service directly to the king. So very straight line hierarchical, and very sort of precisely defined. And the reason it was called indenture was the contract was drawn up on a piece of parchment, and then it was cut in a wavy line, and one person would keep one half, the employer would keep one half, and essentially the employee would keep the other half, and you could prove that that was your contract by putting the two halves together, and you could see that the wavy line matched. So this was the system of indentures, and this was widely used in the 100 Years' War, in the wars in France, for example, where the king was usually the commander-in-chief. Now, the next way in which troops were raised were through the commissions of array. But before I get into the commissions of array, we have to explain that towns and cities that had fortifications, usually to be part of that town or city's structure, there were a certain percentage of people who were expected to offer military service at intervals. So, for example, the Bridport muster roll, which I mention quite often, but there's other muster rolls as well. The town of Bridport in Dorset essentially required a certain number of people to give certain military service at intervals for the protection of the town. Why? Because there were sometimes internal riots, there were small civil wars occasionally at points in English history, and during the 100 Years' War, sometimes the French turned up. So we often focus in the 100 Years' War on the English invasions of France and the English activities in France, but perhaps some of you don't know that the French also invaded England at various points, and also importantly raided the coast of England. So they went on essentially a chevauchée by ship, so raid, a bit like earlier Viking raids essentially, where they would land on the coast, they'd ransack an area, steal a load of stuff, sometimes take people prisoner or slave, and run off again. And of course Bridport is in Dorset. Dorset is coastal, Bridport's is very close to the coast, so this was a problem for Bridport. So it was important that a town like Bridport would have a militia. Okay, so assuming that now we've got, whether it's like London or whether it's a smaller town like Bridport, have their militias, additionally they will draw troops from the local area, agricultural areas as well. So the commissions of array fundamentally were created for the defence of the nation. So a little bit like the draft in World War II, for example, whereby the government tells you, hey, you're being called up because we need you to defend the country. So that was the original plan of the commissions of array. Now, so essentially the king called for, hey, I'm giving a commission of array. A certain number of people from that town, from that city are being called up to give military service for the king. Now, of course, in the Wars of the Roses, there were contenders for the throne, so it wasn't always as straightforward. Now, Graham Turner goes into great detail on this, and I won't go into specific details because it's outside the scope of this video, but the Wars of the Roses are particularly interesting because the commissions of array were, you could say, abused to some extent, and led to confusing circumstances, because you had Henry VI claiming the throne, you had Edward IV claiming the throne, and sometimes they both gave commissions of array at the same time. So certain towns might decide, well, we'll probably support Henry VI, and another town might go, well, we'll support Edward IV. And sometimes a given town or city might get the call to arms from both monarchs. But essentially this is the most similar modern world comparison to this, I would say, is the draft. So it's being called up essentially for national service. So the fourth and final method in which soldiers were raised in this period were mercenaries. And I think everybody knows what a mercenary is. It's very actually similar to the indenture system, except they tend to be people from somewhere else. Classic examples of this, of course, are when Henry Tudor invaded in what led up to the Battle of Bosworth in 1485 to defeat Richard III of England. He had significant numbers of French mercenaries and some Scots as well. The Yorkists had often used people from Ireland. So at the Battle of Stoke, for example, in 1487, they had a lot of Irish there. But in addition, and unusually, I think one of the first times in English history, probably the first time, there were German mercenaries under Martin Schwarz, who was a famous kind of like pre-Landsknecht commander. The Landsknechts weren't quite a thing yet, but almost like an early version of a Landsknecht. So he was a German mercenary commander. And of course, we find the English themselves operating as mercenaries abroad. So the English had operated, particularly English archers with captains and sometimes men-at-arms and knights, had operated in Prussia, for example, in the wars there. They'd also operated famously under Sir John Hawkwood in the White Company and the Great Company in the late 1300s in Italy. And obviously Sir John Hawkwood had gone to a very high level and probably started his career as a mere archer. So mercenaries were used all over Europe. Generally speaking, in England, mercenaries weren't used an awful lot. So the use of mercenaries is relatively unusual. And equally, in the 100 Years' War, mercenaries weren't actually used an awful lot. There were some Germans came over and fought at various points, German knights at various points in the 100 Years' War. And most notably, of course, there are the Genoese crossbowmen who were hired from Genoa, or Genova, in northwest Italy, and came up and fought for the French. Not very successfully, as it happens, but more successfully were the French or Lombard knights or men-at-arms, heavy cavalry, who fought at the Battle of Verneuil in 1424. Although the battle didn't go in the French favour, it was very much successful as far as the Italian heavy cavalry were concerned. And that's a story for another day, because I'm planning a video on Verneuil. But so here we go. So there are the four main ways in which late medieval English, and it has to be said most European armies, were raised. Now, before I close down the video, just briefly to say, these four ways of recruiting soldiers, 4-5 ways of recruiting soldiers, can of course lead to very different troop types. So very clearly, a commission of array where you call up essentially the working classes with whatever equipment the town can provide are going to be the sort of lowest common denominator troops. However, they very often weren't, there were many battles where they weren't present and they weren't used. So those commissions of array, certainly in the Wars of the Roses, often didn't provide the majority of the troops. Very often in the Wars of the Roses anyway, it was different in the 100 Years' War. The majority of the troops were made up from livery and maintenance and personal retainers, households, retinues. And these were, for the most part, probably the best equipped, best motivated troops, if not necessarily the best armed. What do I mean? Well, the best armed were probably mercenaries, because mercenaries' entire job is to sell their services, look really, really flash, and do well enough that they'll keep being employed by various people. And they would switch sides, of course. They would fight for whoever would pay them the most. And we see this in the Italian wars, for example, where mercenary companies would often fight for two sides. We even see it in various other wars as well, including the Wars of the Roses and the 100 Years' War to some extent. But so mercenaries are very often very well equipped, and they might be very well trained, but not well motivated, because if a battle starts to go south, if it starts to go badly, they are far more likely, generally speaking, they're far more likely to go, this isn't going well, we're out of here. Whereas a personal household where they are wearing the livery of a specific lord and they live on that lord's land and they've known that lord for their entire life, and you know everything in the world, their family and everything is connected to that person, they are far more likely to stand there and fight or switch sides, which obviously also happened in the Wars of the Roses. So if their lord says, hey, I'm switching over to Henry Tudor, they go, okay, they just do whatever their lord says. So, very interesting when we compare different equipment, training, motivation, or loyalty, should we say. The indenture system is probably a sort of middle ground. It's interesting because when we're looking at livery and maintenance, and when we're looking at the indentured system, then there is a motivation for captains and lords to make sure that their troops are, number one, relatively well trained. So there's some implication that archers going to France had to meet some sorts of military training requirements, and if they didn't meet those requirements of either physical sort of strength and health or training, then they couldn't go and they wouldn't be hired, a bit like a mercenary. But in addition, we've got to remember that the indenture system, as well as having that requirement, meant someone could also be dismissed as well. They weren't part of the permanent household, and they weren't recruited for life or anything like that, like you might look after a personal retainer under the indenture system. And we know this, that archers, particularly archers, were sent home from France because they were found to be unfit for service. They literally went, you're sacked. So it was far more like a job rather than this kind of loyalty to a lord. So anyway, an incredibly complex thing. I hope I've managed to give you a picture that's relatively concise and relatively understandable, because there are lots of exceptions and there's lots of crossover between these different ways of raising soldiers. Anyway, as always, I have been Matt Easton. I will continue to be. If you've got specific questions on this topic or related topics, I'll be very happy to see in the comments down below, and maybe I can turn that into an upcoming video. Thanks a lot for watching, and I'll see you back on the channel soon. Cheers, folks. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.